I am part of a research group, or actually I'm co-leading a research group here at KTH called Sustainable Futures Lab. And in this group, these are four of the main areas that we're working with: imagining futures. We are also doing research on how to integrate sustainability in the engineering education. We kind of work quite a lot with limits and then making data meaningful. And in the rest of the presentation, I will talk about imagining futures, but before, I just want to give you an example of how to make data meaningful. So at KTH, our largest carbon dioxide footprint comes from flying, actually. So when you do research nowadays, it's connected to a lot of flying. And we have goals at the university that are in line with the Paris Agreement, that we should cut our emissions by 50% until 2030. And it's not really happening. And when you present data to people about flying, it usually doesn't sound so bad. So for example, approximately every employee at KTH flies 3 trips per year, and that doesn't sound that much. But when you kind of dig into the data and you look into it, it looks quite differently. So we've been doing workshops with departments, trying to figure out how they are flying. So this picture shows, for example, a division with 21 people employed, and the green squares are faculty, so professors, associate professors, and the yellow ones are students, PhD students or postdocs. And as you can see here, half of the people in this division have not been flying at all. And the other half have been flying, but not like equally distributed here either. So there's a couple of people who have been flying quite a lot. But these are number of trips and not the amount of carbon dioxide. But if you have sharp eyes, you can see that these poker markers have different colors. So you have green, red, and black ones. And the green ones are short trips, for example, within the Nordics. The red ones are trips within Europe, and the black ones are trips internationally to overseas, basically. So if we instead would represent with poker markers the amount of carbon dioxide, it would look like something like this. So then it's no longer the first person in this list up in the upper corner who has the largest footprint. It's actually in the second person who has been doing a lot of international flights to, for example, the US or to Oceania and stuff like that. So that's a way of materializing data to make it much more tangible and something we can start discuss together. So this is also something that I'm interested in, is to actually engage people in making sense of this data together. Okay, but that's not what I was supposed to talk about today. So today I'm going to talk about the future. So if we step into the future, and it's nice to have such a well-informed group as you to talk to, so I don't have to go into details. I'm just going to remind you of the pathway that we need to be on in order to fulfill the Paris Agreement. So this is the energy transition that we need to do, where we have to be climate neutral by 2050. And the carbon law that Rockström et al. Has stated is quite easy. It's like a rule of thumb that we need to cut our emissions by 50% every decade. So this is something that you can imagine then. And then I want to ask you, so I'm going to do a short, you get some 30 seconds to think on your own. What will your life be in 2030 when we use 50% of the oil we're using today? So we're approximating that we're still in 2020. I mean, we're a couple of years in, but still, what will your life look like in 2030 when we have fulfilled this first step? And then I'm gonna not ask you because we don't really have time to have that interactivity, but I'm gonna guess. And I'm gonna guess that you had a hard time imagining what your life would be like. Is that correct? Could I see any kind of thumbs up or something if you felt that it was difficult? Yeah, it was difficult. Okay. So it's quite known that we have some like lack of imagination. There's like, we're not really well trained in imagining what the future could look like, and when we do, quite often we end up in having these negative images of the future. So it's easy to think about all these movies that we have that have catastrophic events, etc., or Mad Max or whatnot. And this is not really the future that we want, but it's also not something that we can steer away. Like it's not so easy to know what we're going to steer towards when you have these ideas. And sometimes it's hard to see kind of what underlying ideas are governing our current world. It is as if we're the fish swimming in the ocean. We can't really see the water around us. And today we need to see radically different futures if we want to do this transition that's needed to be done. And this is something that Rob Hopkins has been talking about in his book, From What Is to What If. And Rob Hopkins is also the founder of the organization that we have been collaborating with, which is called the Transition Movement. So we've had a research project together with the Transition Movement Sweden. And what we've been discussing with them is that we actually need tools. We need tools to imagining the future. So now I'm going to do something differently. I'm going to just ask you this question. What would your life be now, today, in 2024, if we only use 50% of the oil? So if you imagine, what would it be? How would you get to work if you only could use half the oil? And where would your food come from if you could only use half the oil? And I can imagine, and I'm just guessing now, but I can imagine that it was a little bit easier to start formulating to yourself what your life could look like if we only used half the oil today. And I'm going to come back to why that is. So this is actually something we then explored together with the Swedish Transition Movement. So they wanted to have a method, a workshop method that they could use when they wanted to start up local initiatives in a village, in a county or a region or a city where they were living. And they wanted to invite people who had not perhaps thought about this before. So the transition movement is working with a dual aim of mitigating or adapt to peak oil and also reaching climate neutrality. So they have this double aim of working with these two things. So they wanted a method that they could collect people who had never thought about this before and start planting seeds that then could become action. And we wanted to explore if this idea of imagining an alternative present and thinking about what should have happened in the past, if that could be used in such a context. So over 3 years, we developed a method and did workshops in many places in Sweden. So when the participants come to the workshop, they are first introduced to the fact that in 2008, we didn't have a financial crisis, which it happened in our world. We actually had an oil crisis. And in this oil crisis, we realized that we had to transition our society. And everybody started working quite hard with doing this transition. So they get information about how dependent we are on oil and what it looked like in 2008. And then we make a jump into the future from 2008 into the present, where they get to think about what they are grateful for in our world, but now they are existing in an alternative present, where they get to, in smaller groups, discuss what would everyday life look like. What kind of practices, how do they get the food, how do they transport themselves, how do they live, etc., etc. So they do workshopping on that, putting things on post-its, and then they come back and tell the whole group. We do some clustering of these. Usually the same kind of themes show up. It's usually food, transportation, housing, free time, and work. And then in the next step, which in this picture is called number 4, and they go out in smaller groups again, and they brainstorm what would have needed to happen here in this local place, this city or this region, for us to go from 2008 to this alternative present. So they know what they're steering towards because they know about all these everyday practices, and then they have to think about what needed to have happened. And then at the end, we do a checkout where they get to write down what they would like to do now from this point onwards. And when we step out of this alternative present, this thought experiment, we also say that this is something that we need to do towards the future. And I'm going to show you one of the tools, because we also in this workshop format have different tools to prime the participants to start up the imagination needed. And one of the things that we have is fake or alternative headlines. So these are headline posters for potential magazines and journals that we have. And in this particular case, it's from a workshop where we use this methodology to think about academic flying. And so what if we lived in a world where academics only flew half as much? And these are some of the headline posters. And what's interesting with this when you do headline posters is that you immediately can start like think, is this possible to do? Is it like this now? Or what would the world look like if, for example, there were plastic quotas in the health sector so that you could only get a certain amount of plastics. So this is a way of triggering your imagination. Right, and let's see here. In total, during the project, we were able to do 9 workshops with this methodology. So the first here on the screen are, I should also mention that we we were meant to do this in person, but this project started in January 2020. So quite quickly we had to figure out a way of doing these kind of workshops online. So the first version of the workshop is an online workshop where we use Miro board, etc., and other tools to do this kind of workshopping. So the first workshops were digital. So we did it in Härnösand and Linköping, 2 different cities in Sweden. After that, we did 2 workshops with only people from the transition movement to find new places and also anchor this methodology within the organization. And then we did it in Örebro, which is another fairly large city in Sweden, another one with a transition network. Helsingborg is in the south of Sweden. And then finally, we were able to do 2 physical, like in-person workshops, first in Hellungebygden, which is in the west coast of Sweden, and then Örebro again. So these were all the workshops that we did. And we had participants from 14 years old to 92 in these workshops. And the people who attended, we were doing the facilitation during this period, but we had a host that invited to these workshops that came from the transition movement, except for one of the Örebro workshops where it was actually a environmental strategist at the municipality who did the invitation. But we wanted to have a heterogeneous group. So it was, okay, we invited politicians, but had fairly few politicians coming. But otherwise it was civil servants from either the municipality and the region. It was the local business community from other associations like NGOs and such in this area, or other people who were interested to attend. And we even had a bishop in one of the workshops from the Swedish church. And then just to give you a little flavor of what could happen when we do this. So an interesting thing is when you do this kind of workshop where you are addressing the issue in the past, nobody comes up with AI or technical solutions. So a majority of the suggestions of what needed to have happened has to do with policy or changed behavior. So here are some wild ideas. Apparently we're going to have the Swedish championship in dumpster diving, that is finding food that are been thrown away in Örebro. There will be a gardener advisor at the municipality, which is equal to like the energy and climate advisors that we have in Sweden today, and that can help people start building more resilient food systems. There was also quite often suggestions of using, for example, the school premises for cooking classes or food prep in the evening. So this is like in the Swedish school system, we have classes in cooking food and other kind of household thingies, and those kind of rooms were thought to be shared with the rest of the public. And also one great idea is that not all young people do military service in Sweden today, but perhaps they should do food service. So 1 year working with growing and preparing food would be something that would help strengthen our resiliency and help us to become more climate neutral. So why do we think this works so well? Well, one thing is that when you come to the workshop, you're told that we've already made it. Yay! So you just have to figure out some details about it. And also, we know who we are today. So imagining what life would look like today is much easier. And me in 5 or 10 years' time when I don't really know. Like my kids will probably have moved out of my apartment in 10 years. And I can't really imagine what I would be like. But I know what my life is today when my kids are coming in and out of the apartment, etc. So that's why we think it's easier to release your imagination because you're kind of scaffolded by these facts and variables that you already know things about. Also, we noticed that when we do the check-in in 2008, so everybody comes to the workshop, we have asked them to prepare an exercise before to think about who they were in 2008. And that's what they report when we do the check-in. And that means that everybody leaves their working title. So in the duration of the workshop, they are attending as persons and not as their role that they have in their working life. And we think that also opens up for more creativity. And then even more important than to have a local place, to be grounded in a city or a region actually shows lots of local practices that could happen. So we also think that is beneficial. I have a bad news here. This material is in Swedish, but all of the material is Creative Commons licensed and is available on the Transition Network Sweden's website. We're working on English translation, so I'm hoping that it will show up within March or potentially in April. But if you like the idea, I would just please run with it. We think this is something that anyone can use and formulate workshops or other events where you can imagine what futures could look like in the present. So please use the idea if you like it. And anyone who's a Swede can look at this. And also within Sweden, so since this was an action research project where we worked together with the transition movement, they helped us to also formulate the project. So they worked into the project that we also should do train the trainers. So we've had education on this material 3 times, and there's a bunch of people in Sweden who knows how to run these kind of workshops that you could contact through their website if you want to do something similar. And hopefully English version of it soon. You could also download it and run it through some AI translator if you want to. So that was all that I wanted to present for you, and I actually think I kept the time so that we can have some questions to me. So I'm open for questions.
Yes, Elina, so great and so wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Very interesting to hear this research that you have done, creating this local engagement and bring people into the transition of the society. So I think there are some questions in the chat box, so we can start to have a look on that. So we have, let me see if I can pronounce this name. Ainhoa Mata has written a question asking about if you are talking about eating more vegetables and less meat in order to be more sustainable. Is food something that is taken into consideration?
Yes, for sure. That's always one of the topics that comes up. And I think that like we don't provide them with a ton of facts when they come to this workshop. But when you have this diverse group of people, there's always some who know more than others in particular areas. So usually there's quite a lot of discussion on food and growing your own food also, because when you think about that we're going to use less fossil fuels, you realize that we can't have very long, like not this huge amount of transportation that we've had from other parts of the world. So growing food more locally becomes one of the things that people usually discusses. And it's definitely so that there's more talk about more plant-based diet. But in some areas in Sweden, we have places where it's hard to grow food. And then there's also discussion on how can you get higher biodiversity by having ruminants grazing there. So this, I mean, this is where when you come to the small local details, it might not always be like these grand plans that we see on a global level that works. So these have definitely been part of the conversation.
So people saw that there is a need maybe to eat different. Maybe you cannot eat avocados, for example,
No.
maybe grapes or mangoes, but depending on where you live, of course, but maybe you have to eat in a different ways.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And if we see working in public authorities, I think the first steps towards this transition is working with the policies and putting the targets. And then we need to have the engagement from the society. And I think there are some really great examples. And I think it's very interesting, these findings you made, that when there is the discussion in the group, the thing that people are talking about is not the technical, like they're not speaking about installing renewables, building windmills or solar plants. It's more connected to the everyday life. And I think there are a lot of good suggestions that could be used to really make the transition happen in a way that is very interesting with your research.
I should say that in the 9 workshops we did and in the 3 train the trainers, AI was only mentioned once. And of course, at some points, they might mention renewable energy like solar photovoltaics or things like that. But the majority of the discussions are more on policy. What kind of, also they go from the practical everyday and kind of draw upwards and say that we need regulations around this. So they kind of paint this picture of having a process where also the state policymakers have to put in some regulations or policies that steer society, but not technological development, no.
Yeah, it's really interesting, very interesting. There is another question in the chat box from the same writer asking about if you were speaking about reduction of waste and if you were talking especially about plastics.
So as you saw in one of the headlines, plastic was one of the things we mentioned. That was also like one of the things we had as a primer in these workshops with the transition movement. And if I remember correctly, waste do come up in these workshops. Often people are starting to think about how can we use waste in a local manner, so that closing the loop when it comes to phosphor and nitrogen, like the things that we need for fertilizers, etc., and also reducing plastic. So definitely it came up naturally in these conversations.
Great. So we have Domen here with us also from the University in Ljubljana, one of the partners in the Remarkable project. So he's asking, what are the ideas and prospects with regards to the flying issue that you identified at the beginning of the talk?
Yes. So we have very high flying targets. Or like that's a bad joke. We have targets that we should fulfill, and currently we're not. So I think a problem when you're working with a university as an organization is that you have a line management, and then you have the faculty, and the faculty have quite a lot of freedom in how they use their research funding. So they kind of fly as much as they want because they've gotten the funding from the funders, the money from the funders, and then they can do whatever they want with that money. In Sweden, there's a movement to the funding bodies that we have started to also ask us to tell how we're going to support sustainability, and some of the funders are even writing into the proposal, like the calls that we have to consider carbon emissions in relation to travels in the project, etc. I know that KTH is potentially looking into having some kind of carbon budget for the different departments at the university, because currently we're not able to cut our emissions. So there's work going on both on the research side and on the line management side, but the goals have been there for quite some years, and we fulfilled them, of course, during the pandemic, but now our flying has been rising again. So it's an ongoing conversation at the university.
This is, I think, a big challenge for many of the institutes. We have also another question from Pierre. Pierre is also one of our participants in the remarkable project, hosted a youth challenge in Austria last summer in 2023 called the International Clean Energy Challenge. And Pierre was there together with us as one of the participants. And he's asking if there is any talk from the participants about family planning. Or was that not something that would pop up in those backward-looking reflections?
That's an interesting question. Not really, actually. I think that since we present them with us having been able to cut our emissions by 50%, we don't really take, and we're talking about a local setting, we're not really priming them to think about, for example, overpopulation on a global scale. And I think that this might be different in different in different countries. In Sweden, we still have lots of space. We're not that a densely populated country. However, I think so. Not family planning as such. If you're thinking about population. We did, however, have a lot of discussion around what a good and healthy life is, and people were stating, there were ideas of we would probably be more communal and perhaps not work as much as we do today. So that would mean that we have more time to take care of our own children, or that we do it in a more collaborative way. If we're going to also collaborate around other things like sharing resources or growing food together, etc. So there was, I think, more of that, maybe a discussion in these workshops on how can our society change in terms of how we live and how we spend our time. And quite a lot of people were putting emphasis on that we might not have to be so stressed, that we actually can be less stressed and have more time for family life.
Okay, great. So when you were doing these groups, I was thinking, is there any suggestions? Can you give some kind of idea for the participants here? Maybe some is thinking that they would like to try out this methodology. Can you give some example or some suggestions of how it could be implemented? Is it possible to, for example, in a public authority environment, or how can it be taken forward?
So we're playing around with this idea. We've done it now together with the transition movement, where you have a place that is common, that you all know about the city or the village or the kind of region or the municipality where you're doing this workshop. So you can all talk about what it would be like here. And then we've done a similar workshop, slightly differently worded, when we had with academics internationally. So we had an online workshop with academics from all over the world, and then we had our profession as the common topic. So we were talking about how would our profession change if we do this. And I think it would be possible. So I think that the important thing here is that you have something that you can convene around. And it could be, and we haven't tried it, but we would like to try it, for example, within a company or another organization that is needing some kind of transformational shift. So then you could imagine that you've already done that transformational shift and then thinking about what could it look like. So I think one of the things that is needed is then something to convene on, like using Sweden as an example is too broad. You want to have to be particular and concrete in this workshop. So that's one thing. I can also tell you that one of the workshops worked less well than the others. And there are a couple of things that happened in that workshop, I think, that made it so. One was that the host that invited to the workshop sent out a participant list with everybody's working titles. So everybody had like an idea that, you know, there was a little bit of posturing around what kind of work you were doing. And the other thing was that there were quite, I'm going to speak bad about myself, there were quite a lot of researchers from a local university there who had been working with sustainability for many years. And then the conversations were kind of stuck a bit on like them telling like, oh, we've been thinking about this for a very long time, instead of kind of opening up for new ideas. So then you come back to this, that the more heterogeneous the group is, the better, to perhaps not have a large number of male middle-aged researchers who know stuff. Then it became a little bit more non-generative.
That's interesting. What I'm thinking most about when I hear you speak about this is how we are going to work. Are we going to work like in Sweden, we have a certain amount of work hours, or is that going to be in a different way? Are we going to be rewarded in the same way? Are we going to have the same kind of salaries? Are the vacations going to be the same way? If I cannot fly anymore, if I want to go to Italy, for example, on vacation, I need to take the train, maybe take me 5 days to go there, maybe I need a longer vacation to travel, so many things. This is the kind of question that is popping up in my head. So I think it's really interesting to see that future in front of you and see how your daily life would be. Very interesting. So we will give one last call. If anybody else has any more questions to Elina, you can take your shot. Otherwise, we are wrapping up soon with time. So I am also going to introduce you for the next Climate Leader Lunch Hangout. But we have time for, if there is anyone else who did hold back your question, there is still time to give a shot now. So if nobody's having any more questions, I am going to give the invitation for the next Climate Leader session. So this is a series of invitation that is going to take place until the 27th of June. So the next Climate Leader session will be having in March, on the 21st of March. And the speaker then will be Francesco Punte, who has an MBA and a PhD and is the general manager in ESCAN. ESCAN is the energy consulting in Spain. And he's going to speak to us about the importance of energy communities and the future of local energy production. So the same time as today, we have our slot from 1:15 until 2. So please log in already by 1 so that you are set into the meeting, that you have all your things set, so you don't need to miss the beginning. So the Zoom is open already from 12:45 actually, if you want to arrive early. And then we have Francesco joining us and giving us this talk about energy communities and how they will support the Green Deal and the local energy transition. So now a lot of things came up in the chat box. Let me just see what happened here. Yes, we can also, as Diana from Fedaren is also with us today, and she has also put a post in the chat box that we have a unique webinar in Remarkable on climate leadership on the 13th of March. So there is a link for this in the chat box that you can register, where you can take part of this also. All of this is, of course, for free. There are no costs. And you can also register for the next webinar on the 21st of March. I think there is a link for that also in the chat box. Yes. So we are recording the sessions, and we will check if it's possible. Maybe we can add them on the website. We have the project website. We can also put that in the chat box, Climate Leaders EU. So we can see if it's possible. We can check if it's possible to add this recordings in some way. I'm not sure about that. We have to check that out. So we can check for that and see if it's possible. And in there, you shall also find all the dates and all the speakers and the links if you want to sign up and join. So with this, we're going to conclude for today. And once again, I just want to give a great thank you to Elina. We're so happy to have you with us, so happy to share your research and really interesting findings you have done. I'm sure that this could be brought into many of the local transition plans that is taking place all over Europe. So very grateful that you could share your findings and results with us. I also want to take all of the participants and give a thank you for being here today and sharing your questions and your time together with us. And I really look forward and hope to see you all again in March and for the rest coming session during the spring. Thank you so much for today, and bye to everyone.